is now an active law and has that permanency, which, again, like we talked about at the outset, gives it stability, gives confidence that investment of business will be worthwhile.
I think the durability point is a big factor. Look, when we're talking about, let's say, a data center, that can be a $10 billion project. That's a massive, massive commitment by a company. And they need to know not just that sort of we're okay on policy for the next couple of years. They really need to say, we're going to be able to see this project all the way through and know what the policy environment is going to look like on that. And so the durability really is a big issue. And then the other thing is there's just some things you can't do administratively.
Ambassador Kristen Silverberg, welcome to Reaganism.
Thanks, Roger. It's great to be with you.
Well, I'm so happy to have you here. And you're coming to us, I believe, from the offices of the Business Roundtable, where you serve as President and Chief Operating Officer. You've had a wonderful career in government where you were the U.S. Ambassador to the European Union and also served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, along with positions inside the White House during the George W. Bush administration. But now you're seized by the interest of business and at the intersection of business and government. For listeners and viewers who don't have a good feel for the Business Roundtable, how would you just summarize it?
BRT is an association of about 240 CEOs of large U.S. companies. So we're really focused on how to support policies on trade or tax or energy, corporate governance that can advance a strong U.S. economy. And we do that. Our CEOs come to town. They come to Washington 4 times a year. They run policy committees. They, work together to develop policies that they think can advance a strong U.S. economy. And we spend a lot of time with policymakers talking about the long-term issues impacting the U.S.
So it's probably not very busy for you right now.
It's been pretty frenetic. I mean, it's because you've been in Washington a long time, but it's really, even for those of us who have been around a while, this is a particularly crazy time. And I think the administration President has signed something like 174 executive orders. So really intense. We had a big push on some massive legislation around corporate taxes. And so our CEOs have been in town a lot. They're spending a lot of time with the administration and up on Capitol Hill on key issues.
I mean, the executive orders alone, you probably have an executive orders count, right? I mean, it's just unbelievable. Time of this recording, I think the president just signed a couple, maybe the day prior. I mean, it just continues. And then, of course, the landmark legislation, which is not entirely unique to this iteration of the Trump administration, President Biden. There was landmark legislation. By that I mean just huge bill with many provisions hitting lots of different areas of that would impact business, trillions of dollars on the table. But it's the executive orders, which is quite different. And I think for people in Washington, you've gone from an administration, this is not meant to critique, although I guess embedded in it from my point of view is a critique that was fairly sleepy. I mean, that and you would not characterize dynamic, putting aside the large legislation, to now. I mean, we're seeing dynamism out of that White House, and like it or not, it is so much activity. How do you stay on top of it? This is like, we've talked about this before, but I've never quite asked it you in this way. Like, how do you just feel like you're on top of it, knowing what's happening?
I don't. I mean, the answer is most days I don't feel like we're entirely on top of it, but it's been a really interesting time because, this is an administration that has lots of former business people in it, people who ran companies themselves. So Secretary Burgum or Secretary Wright, Secretary Bessent, and all of them, and I think the president, want to see a thriving business sector. So CEO engagement is always important with the administration or policymakers, whoever's in office, but it feels particularly important right now. And our sense is, agree or disagree, the administration wants to hear if something they're doing is going to have unintended consequences for the ability of companies to grow or employ people or invest domestically. I think they've been open to hearing that. It doesn't mean we agree 100% of the time, but they've been reasonably open to hearing CEOs talk about the impacts on their business.
Yeah, I've heard that too. It makes sense. I mean, the objective has got to be shared between an American CEO and what President Trump is talking about. You just said it's great for business, growth of the economy, growth through American worker. I mean, these are where they want to land. Now, the means of getting there, some of it probably lines up with bread and butter BRT principles. I assume you think about the BBB, the Big Beautiful Bill, and making those tax rates permanent. I imagine that lines up, and that's sort of the predictability and outcome the BRT would have wanted at the outset, and your CEOs wanted at the outset. Tariffs, which we'll get into, of course, that is one that probably unsettles more of your CEOs than settles them.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the Big Beautiful Bill was big. That's accurate. I mean, it had a lot of different pieces of it. We were principally focused on the corporate tax pieces. As you know, in 2017, President Trump had signed historic legislation, which BRT was very involved in passing, to reform the corporate tax code to make the U.S. more competitive, help our companies compete on a level playing field. And a lot of those provisions were expiring this year. So we made a big push with the administration to try to extend those provisions, which the president has now signed. It was a big business effort and success that we did, in close collaboration with.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be a great outcome and gives the predictability for businesses that, of course, they want and seek. It's simply not just about the rate itself, which I'm sure is hugely important for competitiveness, but also to know that this is going to be in place, is not going to be subject to the vicissitudes of Washington politics. At least it's everything, I guess, is up for change any legislative year with any administration. But the permanency really does help, not having that expiration out there. One of the iconic photographs, I wanted to get your take on this, Kristen, that really, I think, set the tone for the administration, perhaps in ways that the commentariat didn't anticipate, is President Trump's inauguration. And, of course, the weather was not cooperative, so it wasn't big and sprawling outside the Capitol. It was inside the rotunda. And, of course, when you get to that limited sort of seating venue, which the rotunda is, people, you kind of criminalize this. You're looking at the seating and where people are, and you had sort of the tech barons seated in front of those that were nominated and would soon be confirmed to be part of President Trump's cabinet. And it did send a message in two ways to me, but I wanted to get your reaction to see if it's played out this way. We'll talk a little bit about some of it in a second. But one, that President Trump wanted to work with business. They were going to have a seat at the table or certainly be nearby. And two, tech in particular. I'm talking about Meta and Google and Microsoft and Amazon, all the barons of it. We're there, despite the battles perhaps that took place in the first administration or in between 45 and 47. And I think it's played out, but I want to get your take. Reading too much into that shot, or did that really send a message in the way that I'm interpreting?
No, I mean, I think it has played out. Actually, a lot of the tech CEOs have worked closely with the administration on issues and have really I think worked together to produce some big successes. So, one of the issues that BRT and other associations have focused on are some digital services taxes, which in our view are used by some of our trading partners to discriminate against U.S. tech companies. And the administration's been working hard on those issues. Canada was one that got a lot of attention, didn't it? Yeah, it did. So anyway, I think there has been really good cooperation between those companies and the administration. BRT is cross-sectoral, so we have those big tech companies. We also have major U.S. manufacturers like General Motors. We have big financial services firms like JP Morgan, lots of energy companies, really companies in every sector of the economy. But I think it's fair to say that the tech companies have had, have built some good relationships within the administration. They have, and the politics perhaps are not intuitive, because oftentimes when you talk to people who are serving the administration, big supporters of President Trump, those in the think tank community, I mean, there was a point of view
certainly the Heritage Foundation advanced this for some time. Big tech was enemy of the state. I mean, that's not me summarizing a point of view. Those were emails that arrived in my inbox out of the Heritage Foundation, and there were battles, of course, between some of those companies, some of those founders, and President Trump. And then you had others in the tech community that felt that these were companies that weren't American companies, right? That we pick on Google here for a second, not any particular member of Business Roundtable per se, but that for some time people said, okay, they were multinational in nature. They were not actually looking to advance. They view themselves and were advancing kind of as an American company. And that's all changed in my mind in a radical way since President Trump has come to office. The politics of tech, I guess, is my takeaway.
I think there are a lot of reasons for the administration to reject that point of view. I mean, one of the big ones is that those are the companies that are driving investments in artificial intelligence, that those are a lot of the companies who are going to determine whether we win this critical race against China on the technologies that are going to, drive the U.S. and the global economy. And so, anyway, I think that has been a big factor that the administration correctly recognizes, that we need to be supporting those companies. And the second thing is that they see that those are the companies that are able to compete with the Chinese in third countries. That when we're that those are companies that can go kind of toe to toe in any market. So anyway, I think there are a lot of reasons for them to kind of reject the strong tech criticism. And in my view, we're in a much better place in terms of the business community and the administration working on critical issues together.
Yeah, I want to stay on that for a second. And you're uniquely positioned to bring in both the domestic and the international, the not just economic policy, but the national security policy too, given positions you've held in government. It's pretty amazing. The other day, yesterday, in terms of this recording, President Trump was at a Hill and Valley summit. He signed 2 executive orders clearing the way as best as he can from the executive to allow for tech, big tech, smaller tech, to leverage the U.S. to realize the energy they need, for example, and make sure that local permitting and other regulatory challenges don't disadvantage U.S. tech companies. That's something you and I have spoken about now at this point over the years. Pretty remarkable that the president kind of took that approach, and it was really as much through a national security lens, Kristen, to me, as it was the economic lens, that we want to win this race against China. The president really seemed to have internalized that.
I think it's both. I think it's, whether the U.S. or China will sort of control the, commanding heights. And also, are we going to be able to realize all the promise of AI in terms of benefits to Americans and U.S. consumers? I mean, we have at BRT, we have sort of lots of pieces of the AI puzzle. We have, as I mentioned, we have major developers like Meta and Google and Microsoft. We have companies who are building massive data centers. Bechtel comes to mind. We have lots of energy companies, and as you mentioned, that's a critical piece of AI, is do you have the energy infrastructure to fuel it? And then we have lots and lots of companies who will be using AI to advance their work. I mean, you think about the way that AI is going to contribute to the development of pharmaceuticals for companies like Eli Lilly, or that will help companies provide better customer service, companies like Walmart, JP Morgan. So anyway, so we're really kind of focused on every piece of that. I think the administration's actions yesterday in terms of releasing their AI plan were pretty positive. We also think that Congress has a big role to play here. And one piece in particular we're focused on is permitting reform, that you really can't build out the energy infrastructure we need under our current system, which really weighs down kind of the building process with this really Byzantine, slow, laborious permitting process. And I'll give you just a couple facts, which is
Yeah, give an example of this, because I've been in a couple of fora with you, and we kind of joke, oh God, this is the boring part, but it's sort of the boring part that is essential to get this right. I mean, getting the states and localities to sort of either step aside or at least give a fair shake in a meaningful timeline could be the difference between whether we succeed at this or not. Am I overstating the matter? That's what I
no, I think
gleaned from
I
listening
think
to
that's
you over the
exactly
years.
right, and not just the state and local governments, but to get the federal government to kind of think about permitting in a new way. About a third of kind of big, federally permitted projects get subject to litigation, which on average will take about 4.5 years. But 80% of those projects, the challenge to the permit is rejected. Courts ultimately say that the permit is going to go ahead. And so that means that a huge percentage of projects are delayed for 4.5 years with actually no, impact on the environmental review. That tells me that we're spending a lot of time kind of litigating issues that weren't that meritorious. So one thing we really want Congress to do is shorten the statute of limitations and try to address some of the standards around getting a permit enjoined, things like that. So just some common sense things that can keep our environmental standards where they are, but can really expedite the process and make sure that we can build in America. It's interesting because obviously you and I have both served in, Republican policymakers, but I'm seeing growing appreciation of this issue on the Democratic side.
Interesting.
With the abundance agenda, President Obama made some comments about the need for Democrats to really commit to being able to build things in America. So anyway, it won't be easy to pass legislation in this environment, but we think there is a prospect of getting 60 votes in the Senate and a good vote in the House for some common sense permitting reforms, and that's where BRT is going to be spending a lot of our time.
And really, that's not so much something the states are doing or localities are doing, but I'm hearing you say it's trial lawyers and really and others of that ilk just being litigious, and they, I guess the strategy is, if we can delay it, that's good, and maybe bankrupt them through the litigation, so business just says it's not worth the squeeze.
I think that's part of it, and some of it is just the federal bureaucracy. So we have a statute that sets out a process for environmental review, but administrations have piled pieces and pieces on that. So what started out as a relatively manageable statutory process has now turned into this just really unwieldy system for trying to build anything in America. And so anyway, I think there's a lot of room for this. I think it would have big benefits for U.S. energy, for U.S. jobs, and for this AI race we were talking about. I think we'll get a lot of support from building trades, who I think they see the same issues. So we're working on putting together a really strong bipartisan coalition to try to get this passed.
And just one more follow-up on that, Kristen, because certainly as I think about the regulatory state, there's a lot that can be done via executive order and, RIRA, these sort of offices that exist that people don't know a lot about but tend to wield a lot of power and influence. Is the reason why you and the Business Roundtable are seeking to do this legislatively is because, yes, an administration could get some of this done or get a lot of it done, but it could be quickly reversed when another administration comes in and reacts against it. So you have it legislatively, it's now an act of law and has that permanency, which, again, like we talked about at the outset, gives it stability, gives confidence that investment of business will be worthwhile.
I think the durability point is a big factor. Look, when we're talking about, let's say, a data center, that can be a $10 billion project. That's a massive, massive commitment by a company. And they need to know not just that sort of we're okay on policy for the next couple of years. They really need to say, we're going to be able to see this project all the way through and know what the policy environment is going to look like on that. And so the durability really is a big issue. And then the other thing is there's just some things you can't do administratively. And the administration has taken some really good steps on administrative permitting reform, but there are pieces of it, including the litigation piece I mentioned earlier, where you need congressional action. So as I say, I think there is a lot we can do, and we're going to certainly make a strong run at it.
one of the things I think is fascinating about this is I hear a discussion about AI and servers and getting the energy to support AI, and it doesn't make me think of the coasts. What's fascinating about where we're at this moment as we're trying to build the AI stack or the infrastructure, it takes me to places like Iowa. And I find in all these debates and policy discussions that we're witnessing, triggered by the Trump administration, it's a lot more about Iowa than it is about, let's say, California or New York or even Texas. Here's what I mean. Let's just stick with Iowa for a second. Right, you have the server farms, right? The farms of the future, right? They want to build. I think, was it Google announced? One of the big tech companies announced a major investment in Iowa, right? They got the space and the interest in having it built out there, right? That's going to drive the AI, and then they need the energy there as well, and then I'll just throw one on top of it that's not related to AI world directly, but then the tariffs, right? And the community that has so mobilized and seem to have at least been able to get the exception, at least in part, on Trump administration's use of tariffs is the ag community also in Iowa. I mean, it's just kind of fascinating some of the places that are playing in the policy space as we think to have this moment where we're reindustrializing the United States and we're trying to build the economy for the future.
No, that's right. I mean, for the data center question, think about cold states because it takes less energy to cool the data centers. Our friend Dave McCormick, of course, had a huge event in Pennsylvania around his effort to really make that state, the focus of a lot of AI investment. Was kind of enormously successful convening he had.
Amazing. You had the president there, and it seemed like the entire cabinet. And this was in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, a lot of CEOs. It was just fantastic. And you can imagine places, you can imagine North Dakota, a place with energy resources and a cold environment. So I agree with you that this is going to be different than the kinds of, economic booms we've seen other times. And I also agree with you that the tariff debate is really sort of interesting. I mean, we have, as I mentioned, we have companies in every sector. I think some of the companies that are hardest hit by the tariffs are manufacturing companies, particularly companies who are manufacturing for export, because they both have to worry about higher costs of inputs, but then they also have to worry about retaliatory tariffs. And so anyway, those are companies that may be, based in, I don't know, Appalachia, places like that really, really have to make a case on how we get to a really sound tariff policy.
So we'll talk about tariffs here in a moment, but stick with Senator Dave McCormick and his event recently. Fascinating. To me, my takeaway was this was one of the best demonstrations of good policy and good politics coming together. Here's what I mean. Pennsylvania is sort of what Ohio was a generation ago. It is the swing state. You win Pennsylvania as a presidential candidate, you're really going to be in position to become president of the United States, right? We saw that last election, I think is happening, likely to happen again. Democratic governor, Republican senator, or one of two senators Republican. Here you have two cities, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, that dominate the economy of that state. But at the same time, the rural part of the state, big supporters of the president. They want to take advantage of AI. They want to be the energy leader, right? Fracking, all these pieces coming together, and you come out of this moment where it seemed to me that it was like win-win-win. The people in Pittsburgh were happy. They're going to benefit from the tech world, and sort of the Appalachia side of it as well. Seem to be happy because it's going to benefit the economy, create jobs in the energy sector and elsewhere. Am I reading that right?
I thought it was great politics and interesting in how deliberately bipartisan it was. I mean, Dave had...
Tell me more about that, because I didn't see that coverage quite as much. So how was it deliberately
Governor
bipartisan?
Shapiro was there.
Right.
Obviously, you've seen a lot about Senator McCormick, how closely he's worked with Senator Fetterman on issues impacting the state, but I thought it was neat that he had the governor there. But to be honest, the thing that really stuck out for me from the event is how substantive it was. It was really serious policy discussion, as you'd expect from Dave and from Dina. So
Yeah.
anyway, so that was the part I loved about
I
it.
mean, and by that you mean like
Exactly as
Senator
you say.
McCormick. This is somebody who was, co-CEO of Bridgewater, one
Yeah.
the world leading hedge fund. Before that, he served in senior roles in the Bush administration with you. He was Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs. I mean, he did a lot of time in China on behalf of the United States in the Department of Commerce. I mean, so what stood out you from a policy level in terms of real discussion of ideas and issues?
Yeah, I mean, well, he has real policy chops, as you said, as does Dina. And I thought the way they tackled the energy issues, I mean, permitting reform, it made me so happy it came up in almost every panel. So anyway, so I thought that was great to see real substance coming out of, coming out of a critical member of the U.S. Senate.
Right, and politically, it clearly, I think, advantaged the president, advantaged Senator McCormick. I mean, hard to argue against more jobs, right?
Yeah.
More money coming into the state that would inevitably result from the focus on AI and all the downstream effects for the voters in Pennsylvania. We're with Ambassador Kristen Silverberg. She is the president and chief operating officer of the Business Roundtable with senior positions in government. Love talking policy and ideas with Kristen, one of the best people to get a sophisticated take on things. Let's talk tariffs here, because if there was one area that probably makes business leaders cringe and are trying to manage and trying to figure out how to handle President Trump and his administration's approach to the economy, it's got to be the tariff piece. I don't think there's a close second. We did a survey on this, and we talked about this when we last saw each other earlier this summer, where we saw there was support for President Trump's tariffs, but if you kind of go into the details a little bit more in terms of what people support, they like it as a tool towards advancing the U.S. economy and lowering barriers. But if it's sort of something that is a fixture made permanent, then the support sort of wanes off. That's what we saw from our survey. And it's sort of a sweepstakes in D.C. whether or not the tariffs are here to stay or a tool to reduce barriers. And I guess businesses, I expect, I'd love to hear what you're hearing from business leaders, are trying to figure out the answer to that question too.
Yeah, I mean, the administration is focused on some very serious trade disputes we have with other countries, including some countries with whom we have, really close relationships. Some of these are longstanding issues. I mean, some of the things they're raising with Europe were issues that were on my agenda when I was, ambassador to the EU and under the Bush administration. So some of these are very, they've hit on some very serious issues. And I think there is a prospect that this process produces some wins in those areas, that the administration is able to leverage the tariffs to get other countries to the negotiating table to make some concessions. The Canadian concession on DSTs is a great example, but there are lots of other opportunities for that. And I think most CEOs would say, look, a short-term or targeted tariff to get another country to the negotiating table to get concessions can make a lot of sense for the long-term interests of the U.S. They'd have a real worry about long-standing or overly broad tariffs for lots of reasons. I mean, one is the issue I mentioned earlier about just how it would hit U.S. manufacturing. So manufacturers paying a bigger part of inputs, how it would hit consumers. So, the cost of tariffs come from somewhere. They either come from they get passed on to the consumer in form of higher prices. They result in less investment or less hiring, or they come out of, the company's profit margins, in which case they hit shareholders, but, they come out one way or the other. And so I think they'd say, look, there's a great opportunity to use this process to get some concessions from other countries to try to level the playing field. And, let's lean forward and do that. I think if they were, long-standing tariffs, if they became a permanent part of our trading relationship, they'd have real concerns about what that would mean for kind of growth and prosperity in the U.S.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember talking to someone who I know who's has factories around the world, part of their business, including the United States, and was trying to get a sense of what it would take for that CEO to invest in manufacture or factory in the United States as a result of this. Sort of it make it so costly because of tariffs to produce overseas that you'll bring it home, which is part of the rationale. You think the vice president would often talk about this. This is part of the pathway to reindustrializing the United States is to drive the incentives to manufacture here, and the barriers or the tariffs would de-incentivize. But the response got to take like 14 years. They need to have confidence that this would sort of the tariff regime would have to be made, and perhaps not permanent, but be in place so long, and it really wouldn't. I guess the net outcome of that conversation was it was unlikely it was going to drive behavior in a way that they would otherwise make an investment that they weren't already going to do.
It really depends on what kind of company you're talking about and on their footprint. You can imagine a company that's producing something mostly for sale into the U.S. market where on the margins, tariffs might, tilt their calculus about whether they want to onshore some production. I think there'll definitely be cases of that. There'll be other cases of companies that maybe they want to produce in the U.S. for export, and the tariffs might create the opposite incentive, an incentive to move production offshore so they don't have to worry about paying tariffs coming in or paying retaliatory tariffs going out. So I think it's going to cut lots of different ways. I mean, in our view, as I said, the best case scenario is the Trump administration takes this moment where a lot of countries are coming to the negotiating table and sort of, heard them and are coming to the negotiating table and uses that as leverage to negotiate down tariffs and non-tariff barriers on both sides, to take them down, particularly where we're focused on our closest trading partners and allies. So when we're talking, especially about Canada and Mexico, Europe, Japan, and so on. The other critical thing we think they could do with this leverage is try to get all of those countries, our close trading partners, aligned around a common approach to China. I mean, the administration has hit on a really important point about global trade imbalances. In our view, most of those imbalances the most important imbalances originate from China in lots of different ways. I mean, some of it is that the Chinese use, licensing requirements and foreign ownership restrictions and regulatory rules to make it hard for U.S. companies to do business in China. So there's not reciprocity in terms of our market access. But maybe as importantly, the Chinese use aggressive intervention in their economy, massive subsidies and overinvestment that enable their companies to sell at artificially low prices in third markets. And so when a U.S. company is competing against a Chinese company on, let's say, chemicals or steel in a third country, they're not doing it on a level playing field. So in my mind, this is a point that Ambassador Lighthizer, I think, has made, with a lot of credibility, that the most critical issues are the ones coming out of China. And so anyway, as I said, we hope that the administration uses this negotiating process to get to some good deals, to get tariffs and non-tariff barriers down with our allies, and then uses it to try to align all of those countries.
Oh, that would be a great outcome, this idea of getting to a framework. We have the individual trade agreements or with each of our most important trading partners, Mexico, Canada, EU, Japan. You mentioned, maybe you want to comment on the latest deal with Japan that seems to be quite consequential. The Treasury Secretary, Secretary Besson, has said that this is sort of unconventional, I think was the word he used, or certainly not the typical sort of agreement. But that's one level, and that would be great. But the next level, Kristen, what you just said, is that actually if it could address the actor here that is making it quite difficult for everybody involved, which is the People's Republic of China. Maybe I can get you to react to one element. You look overall at the Trump administration. I'm not speaking specifically to trade, but it, I think is part of this too. Trump administration is working their way through the Middle East on security issues and trade issues. Seems to be doing the same thing with Europe. The Ukraine piece is taking a turn where President Trump has gotten his footing on that and recognizes what Putin will or will not do. Trade piece seems to be in play. Not much on China, actually. It's the biggest issue that they haven't attacked head on. Yes, there's an agreement in place vis-a-vis trade because both sides needed something. You know, the minerals and for the United States, China seemed to have wanted the pharma. I do get the sense that if we look at maybe year 2 of the Trump administration, I would fully expect China to come into focus. Many of the issues that the economy and the trade side, I would think would surface. And I think the Trump administration would be well positioned if it could get the trade agreements in place with our most important and largest trading partners. But I guess you've been surprised, or do you see sort of it being approached in the systematic fashion that I'm suggesting? Kind of China coming up last almost, even though it's the most important issue.
I've been a little bit surprised by that as well. And as I say, I think there is a real opportunity here. The other big opportunity is to try to shore up, U.S. resilience in a bunch of areas around critical supply chains. So to make sure that we've kind of patched up vulnerabilities in terms of our, over-reliance on China with respect to critical minerals or printed circuit boards or, pharmaceutical precursors, those things. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do. And the business community has spent a lot of effort diversifying their supply chains out of China. I mean, that was starting with the first Trump administration and through the Biden administration, that's been a big effort. There are things the U.S. government could do to expedite that. And one would be sign good trade agreements with alternative markets. So if you want to, see companies take some of their, Asia-focused production out of China and put it somewhere else, make sure you have trade deals that provide intellectual property protections and investor protections and those kinds of things. So anyway, I do think there's a lot of work for the administration and the business community can do together on all of the China-related issues.
I'd love to get your reaction and sort of what you've heard from CEOs and other major players in the economy to the trade deal or agreement with Japan. So you have the 15% reciprocal tariff remains in place, but it's generally received positive reviews even from, the journal editorial board, the full-on, free market group.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has some good pro-business provisions in it. I think of it a lot, though, similar to the way we thought about the UK trade deal, which is this should be a first step, not a final step, that really what we're trying to do is address some of the core issues in the relationship, but then get to a place where we're both taking our tariffs and non-tariff barriers down as much as possible. So I hope that this isn't the landing spot in terms of our tariff levels, but I'm confident the administration's going to keep working with all of our
No deal's permanent. That seems to be the rule here.
Yes, good point.
Although I do think there's something quite admirable about the approach. It feeds volatility, and that's not good for reasons we've discussed. But I'm really struck by what you said. Some of the issues that were before the U.S.-EU, were there when you were serving as our ambassador to the EU, and I think policymakers and people in Washington often just assume things are fixtures, that they can't be revisited. And, of course, seems to be the DNA of President Trump is, what do you mean? It doesn't have to be this way. And I think in the world of trade, we're getting good and bad out of it. But if the outcome is as you're working for, where net it reduces barriers and makes it easier to import and export, and it's cheaper for the consumer, well, then it's good. We're revisiting all of that.
Well, I'll give an example that I think you may have heard me talk about this before, but in, coming out of World War II, the U.S. participated in this Bretton Woods agreement. It set up the big Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank, but it also set up this global kind of monetary management system that determined how currencies were exchanged with the dollar, but also set up the system where the dollars were convertible into gold. And for lots and lots of reasons over time, this became really untenable. The U.S. wasn't confident it had the gold reserves. It had a lot of concerns about other countries' trading practices, about persistent trade deficits. Actually, a lot of the issues we're talking about right now. And so in 1971, President Nixon went off with a bunch of advisors and came back and made this announcement. Okay, Bretton Woods monetary management system is over. You can no longer convert dollars to gold. I'm imposing some tariffs, short-term tariffs, and I'm going to use those to try to get other countries to negotiate changes basically to exchange rates. And it was a huge shock to the system. I mean, it wasn't, our allies didn't like it. All of the ones who'd been holding dollars found out they were no longer convertible, were unhappy. But the Nixon administration, used it kind of very strategically, used the shock of the system to go sit down, negotiate deals with our allies, and it ended up coming out of that system. We had closer cooperation with our closest allies than we did before. So it wasn't pain-free and it wasn't risk-free, but they were very, very deliberate about making sure we had closer trade ties, closer relationship with our partners afterwards than we did before. And I think on the whole, it came with some downsides, which economists talk about, but on the whole, I think was a pretty successful outcome. And I hope that all of this kind of, all the issues we're facing now in terms of, concerns about inflation, about impacts on employment, softening economy, all those things. I hope the administration can kind of keep working with trading partners to try to get to a place where we really have improved our trading relationships.
It's a big sweepstakes, both in terms of whether it will improve trading relationships and overall has been a net benefit for the U.S. economy. Are we going to gain more from this than not, given the apple cart being upset and everything being on the table? Last question before we go to lightning round with Kristen Silverberg, the President and Chief Operating Officer of the Business Roundtable. At the Reagan National Economic Forum, we had a really interesting discussion between our trustee, Joe Lonsdale, one of the founders of Palantir and founder of 8VC, a venture company, and he interviewed on stage Mark Andreessen, founder of Andreessen Horowitz. And it was remarkable to me. One thing, he said a number of interesting things, but the one I want to harp on and get your reaction to was he came to the Reagan Library, to the Reagan National Economic Forum, and started invoking President McKinley. And he talked about McKinley, which of course is not a surprise because there have been those inside the White House that have been talking about President McKinley too, certainly the advocates of tariffs. And he said, talked about the history of McKinley. This is Mark Andreessen, again, one of the major drivers of venture capital and investment and innovation in the United States, and said that to industrialize the United States, McKinley used tariffs and it worked, and it suggested that there's wisdom behind linking sort of tariffs and bringing in industrialization, manufacturing to the United States, bringing it back. Struck me as the wrong place to do it, and not entirely convincing as whether that history was as good as Andreessen recalled, and certainly whether it would be something that worth repeating here for America's economy in 2025. Your reaction to, sort of the McKinley-esque policies and whether that will drive manufacturing in the United States, because that surprised me.
I think it's a huge risk in terms of thinking, and I think most U.S. manufacturers today have a lot of concerns with the current tariff environment. As I said, it hits them first because most manufacturers rely on at least some foreign inputs, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon.
So the supply chain is one huge difference, perhaps, between
it's very different
19th century and 21st century.
So I'd say the global economy is very different. The way in which, the kinds of ways that, U.S. manufacturers grow, which is by having scale, not just to sell into the U.S. market, but to be able to sell all over the world. It's virtually impossible to think of a major U.S. manufacturer being able to go toe-to-toe with the Chinese unless that's a manufacturer who has scale to compete all over the world. So they can't just be competitive here. They've got to be competitive everywhere. And, manufacturers feel like they're already, they're operating really since 22 with low margins, low inventories. And so that's why you're starting to see some real kind of softening numbers around the U.S. manufacturing sector. My own view is there is a way, actually, the administration can really give a boost to U.S. manufacturing, and it's to make sure they can compete on a level playing field by dealing with some of the issues around, Chinese overinvestment and subsidies of manufacturing that are making it hard to compete.
Yeah, great point. That goes back to what you were talking about before in terms of getting a framework in place with some of our most important trading partners. All right, let's go to lightning round. Here's where we ask our guests to provide their favorite Reagan quote, speech, book. We'll take all three, two, or just one. What do you have to share, Kristen?
Let's see. My favorite speech might be the farewell address in 89. It was like classic Reagan, very heartfelt, funny, sweet. And it's an interesting speech because he explains, I think for the first time, what he means by shining city on the hill. And yes. And he talks about that it's a place with kind of robust, open ports. As you know, Reagan was a strong free trader. So he talks about open ports and a lot of commerce and creativity. And that actually captures exactly what Business Roundtable is all about. So kind of a Reagan-esque description of our mandate. My favorite quotes. Well, I love all the stories. After Reagan was shot in 81 and was taken to the hospital, and he's wheeled into the operating room, and he says, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." And then one of his aides came in to reassure him that the government was functioning normally, and he said, "Now, why do you think I'd find that reassuring?" And so, anyway, again, classic Reagan, like very funny and decent, enormous kind of grit and resolve and decency all wrapped into one. And then my favorite book is the easiest one because, as you know, my husband, Paul Leto, wrote a really wonderful book about Reagan. He published it in 2005 called Ronald Reagan and His Quest to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And it remains a very important book because it talks about the role that Reagan personally played in developing his nuclear abolition policy and then developing the strategy around SDI. And I think it really put to rest the notion that Reagan was a policy or strategic lightweight. I think it's impossible to read the book and not appreciate what a just incredible kind of thinker and strategist he was. So anyway, great book to recommend to all of your listeners.
Yes, Paul Leto's book. Did more to explain Reagan's nuclear abolitionism and his involvement in the Strategic Defense Initiative than perhaps any other treatment of the subject, and he did it when he was so young. It takes that impressive project even to a higher level. Just amazing.
And as you know, he's writing another book now, which will have on the history of national security strategies, which will have an excellent Reagan chapter.
Can't wait for that. Kristen Silverberg, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Roger. It's so great to be with you.